My name is Janice Talley. I am the Director of Planning for Montclair Township, and we are happy to be here tonight to take you through the latest revisions to the Lackawanna Plaza redevelopment plan. As you may or may not know, we've been working on some form of this plan since 2014. We spent over 3 years working on the initial draft, which was prepared in 2017, but unfortunately, that draft was not adopted, and the property owner at that time decided to proceed with a site plan application to the planning board, which took about a year to go through the process. And after it was approved, it was subject to litigation, which delayed any new activity at the site. Since then, the previous owner sold the property. We have a new owner that's BDP Holdings, and the new owner has a new vision. So back in 2022, the owner approached the township with the desire to prepare a redevelopment plan, working with the township to come up with a shared vision for this property. So we worked with the developer and the various groups and came up with an initial draft of this redevelopment plan in November 2022. And it was introduced to the council and to the public. And after its introduction, we spent a lot of time listening to comments from the planning board, comments from the Historic Preservation Commission, the Housing Commission, the Environmental Commission, other interest groups throughout the town, neighborhood groups, neighbors, as well as members of the council, and the property owner. And as part of that listening phase, we went back and forth to try and make changes to the plan to address the issues that were identified, as well as come up with a plan that satisfied the vision of both the township council and the developer. As you know, we've also done some additional studies. We did a traffic study. We did a parking analysis. We're in the process of doing an economic impact report. We anticipate that report will be available next week. We've also brought on board the township civil and stormwater engineers to evaluate the site conditions and craft language for the redevelopment plan to provide the necessary protections regarding stormwater. So what we have tonight is, and what we've posted on our website, is the latest version, the July version of the redevelopment plan for Lackawanna Plaza. We anticipate that this redevelopment plan will be introduced by the Township Council at their August 15th meeting. What we want to do tonight is take you through the changes to the plan. I'll introduce you to our panel of experts. First off will be Keenan Hughes, who's a licensed professional planner with Phillips Price, a planning firm in Hoboken. We have Iris Smith, an architect and principal with Smith Marin Architects, who's been working on many of our redevelopment plans to ensure that we have appropriate design standards and controls to get the kind of development that we want to see in Montclair. Other experts we have here tonight is Joseph Fischinger. He's a traffic engineer with Brightview Engineering, and he worked on the traffic impact study. We have Jerry Giosa. He's a parking expert with Level G Associates. He's very familiar with parking issues and parking supply in Montclair, and he's also very well versed in shared parking arrangements, which when you have mixed use development such as we have in this project in Montclair, you have to carefully craft the requirements to make sure that the balance of uses works. And that's what Jerry has given us guidance on. And finally, we have Peter Tenkate and Selwyn Joy, civil engineers with a background in not just civil engineering, but stormwater management from Boswell Engineering. What I would like to do is encourage anybody who's listening to use the chat function. I had thought we'd have a Q&A function on this format in WebEx, but I believe it's just limited to the chat function. So at the end of the or throughout the presentation, if you send me any questions you have in the chat directed to me, At the end of the meeting, we will answer your questions, but we will be able to do that through the chat function. Also following up, you can feel free to send me any emails with any follow-up questions you'd like us to address as well, and I will be able to address those with you individually. So to start off, Keenan or Ira, maybe Ira, I believe you're going to be starting off talking about the biggest changes to the redevelopment plan and the vision.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Janice. And I'll prompt Keenan, you've got control. I'll prompt you as we go along. So as we look at a number of slides I'll share with everyone, I want to make sure it's understood that these are conceptual images, illustrations that are based on the current redevelopment plan and consistent with the guidelines and requirements therein. Doesn't mean that exactly what you see will be built, but something very much like what you see. That's maybe a place where people might have follow-up questions, but as we go through the presentation, I'll do my best to explain what is a requirement versus what the guidelines might allow for. So using this slide as our agenda, I'll be focusing on three areas. The project, compared to what was last publicly shared, is leaner, greener, and has more robust historic preservation requirements. And before we go on, I'll just explain quickly. I'll take you through some visuals associated with each of these areas, and then we'll take a deeper dive into each of these areas. When we talk about leaner, we're talking about reductions in mass. And that means every building that was previously proposed has been touched. I'll explain how, and you'll see that in a few minutes. The number of residential units has been reduced. It was 375 previously, now it's 300. On the greener side, we're talking about 3 public plazas that have been retained. I think it's important that we do what we can, not only to tell you what's changed, but to comment on what hasn't changed, what's still in the plan, which we know might have been seen in a positive light, so that people won't be overly concerned or confused about what might have gotten left out. So the 3 public plazas have been retained, and in fact, a 4th public space has been added. And the more robust historic preservation requirements, the plan now uses shall in place of where it had should previously, technical language, but it is a higher level of what's required of the redeveloper. And there's greater clarity for the treatment of each of the historic elements on the site. In fact, we go beyond that and introduced additional language of what to do in the event additional historic elements are uncovered during the course of construction. So let's take our first look at leaner. And this is a summary slide for the benefit of everyone. We'll start with building A in the bottom left. And building A is the one that sits next to the historic waiting room. There was concern expressed by the Historic Preservation Commission, the Planning Board, and others that building A looked like it might overwhelm the waiting room. Building A now steps back twice away from the waiting room, and I have additional drawings we'll get into later in the presentation. Building B, just above it, used to have 6 stories along Glenridge Avenue. Now it has 5. It's a little hard to see, but there are dashed lines that depict where the mass has been taken away. Traveling over to the east side of the property, building D, same thing. The entirety of it used to be 6 stories. It's now 5 stories. And you can see in the northeast corner, a large triangular section has been removed from the project, further reducing the mass of building D and creating an opportunity, speaking to the greener issue of creating a triangular pocket park in the northeast corner of the project. Building E, like building D, has lost its 6th story, so it is also a 5th story, a 5-story building. And both D and E saw dramatic increases in the stepping back from the eastern edge of the property in order to guarantee quality light and air for the residents of the Montclair Mews just to the east. And I'll cite some numbers a little bit further on. And then finally, building C. Building C has been mirrored. And the result of that is that it now steps down toward the plaza in recognition of the scale of the waiting room. and bringing more attention to the entrance of the supermarket and the historic platform canopies that will remain there. So it's still shaping that outdoor room, but doing so in a gentler manner than before. Next slide. And this is just to depict the same view without all of those notes and annotations. I believe this is being recorded, so people should have a chance at a later date to zoom in or freeze, pause the screen, and see the difference between those dashed red lines and what I was just describing. Next slide. Now we're actually in the northeast corner. We were previously closer to the intersection of Bloomfield and Gates and Lackawanna. Now we're in the northeast looking toward the southwest. We can see the rather dramatic removal of the mass that's shown in the dashed red lines here, producing the pocket park I've mentioned. And you can also see how building B is scaling as a 4-story building along Glen Ridge and jumps up to 5, not 6 stories as we travel southward. You get a little bit better look for buildings D and E. Oops, sorry, Keenan, wasn't quite ready. You can see how the masses of buildings D and E have been pushed away from that eastern edge as well in this view. Okay, next slide, thanks. So when we talk about historic preservation, the waiting room is the star of the show, and it's not going anywhere, and there's language for its preservation and adaptive reuse outside and in, but there are other historic elements on site. Next slide. And all of these are, as I mentioned, described in greater detail in the plan itself, the redevelopment plan that was posted a few days ago. But quickly to orient you, the platform canopy that faces Bloomfield Avenue remains complete and intact. The brick wall is what's removed, and that becomes the new face of the supermarket. There are other canopies on the eastern side of the waiting room. Those also remain in place and are untouched. Inside the mall, we have several platform canopies. Approximately half of those remain in place and bring character and dynamic environment to the future station plaza, and I have 3D views of that. The other half of those platform canopies are allowed to be relocated in the plan, and that is the case. I won't go through all the math unless it's necessary later. There are about 55 of these platform canopies. I'm referring to the steel column or stanchion and the concrete above. About 10 are being reserved for possible reuse in order to replace or repair the other 45. But the great majority, about 2/3, remain in place. Upper right, we've got the old commuter stair that leads up to Grove Street. That'll be rehabilitated and become functional again. The horse watering trough is one of the only other elements that is allowed to be relocated in the plan. Below that, we have this decorative pylon. Its mate is closer to that commuter stair. Both remain in place and are to be rehabilitated. Next slide.
Ira, if I can just quickly just interrupt, I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah.
I've been informed from some of our attendees that the chat function is not available for attendees, and neither is the Q&A. So
Okay.
fortunately, we thought that the chat function and or the Q&A would be functional. It is not. So I welcome anybody who has questions as we go through the presentation. You can either send me a text if you have my cell phone number, or send me an email. My email address is jtalley, that's T as in Thomas, ALLEY, at montclairenjusa.org. And when we're done with the presentation, I will go through those questions. I apologize. We were not aware that this is a new function on WebEx, and we were not aware that that was not available. So go ahead.
Okay, no, thank you, Janice. And I'll do a reminder in a few slides if anyone happens to be joining us late. Thank you. And just to wrap up this initial overview, the terminal shed, which now we're at the west side of the project site, the terminal shed remains intact. The outward columns and the terracotta roof, the book-ended brick and stone pieces all remain in place. in this redevelopment plan. Below it is a photograph that might surprise several of you. This is a space that exists today, and it's actually historic. This was a public skylit passage that's mostly been closed off to the public, and we are uncovering it and making it part of an essential circulation route for the plan, for the people under the current redevelopment plan. More on that later. And then we have 3 pairs of decorative entry piers, and those all remain in place. There's a pair near Bloomfield Ave that brings you into the current surface lot. That's the top image. Middle right, that's the pair that's close to Lackawanna Plaza and Bloomfield Ave. And then another set, which you may not have noticed if you don't travel into this part of the site a whole lot. There's a parking lot west of the terminal shed, of course, and there are 2 piers there, all of which remain in place. Next slide. So when we talk about leaner, there are different ways to discuss it, and it starts with mass. And this is one of the easiest things to explain. Next slide. We're going to take you down to ground level now, and we're depicting for you building E along Bloomfield Avenue looking west. The Montclair Mews is visible to the right. This was what the previous plan allowed for, a 5th and 6th story on building E on the right side. Next slide. Now you can see it's been reduced to 5 stories. That 5th floor is dramatically stepped back, 17 feet, in fact, from the east side to the face of the 5th floor, and I believe it's about 10 feet along Bloomfield Avenue. These are very generous step backs compared to prior redevelopment plans we've had. Next slide. This view's been circulating a bit, and it shows you from across the street what the effect might be. The building will read as a 4-story building from most locations. If you are across the street, you'll get a peek at that 5th floor, obviously. Or if you're further to the west and starting to go up slope, you'll get a peek at that 5th floor as well. Next slide. Now along Glenridge Avenue, the before and after as well, we're looking at the redevelopment plan that we had previously, which showed, as I've mentioned, the building D had 6 stories, and it filled out its block quite completely. Next slide. The building's been much reduced by losing that 6th floor, as well as having that triangular section taken out of it. And instead, we get a much more inviting facade that's lower, less imposing on the neighborhood, as well as the addition of a pocket park. Next slide. Greener. So when we talk about greener, there are different facets of that as well. Let's take the next slide. And one entry point is to talk about open space. Open space not only facilitates the possibility of greenery, but also usable additional space. You could think of it as passive recreational space. To really drive this point home, I want people to notice on the left, this drawing is what we have there today, and what's shown in black is the footprint of a building. What's shown in gray is parking. On the right is what the redevelopment plan calls for. Again, buildings have a black footprint, and white indicates areas for pedestrian. Gray, again, is reserved for cars. The important thing to note is that the plan on the left really prioritizes cars, vehicles, over pedestrians, clearly. The plan on the right is much more accessible and inviting for pedestrians, not only the beautification possible with greenery, but the idea that you have a healthier environment in which to walk and a safer environment in which to walk. This also relates to the conversation about how this project ties into the neighborhood. If you can't walk into the project, if you can't walk into the site plan, which is kind of how it is now, without looking over your shoulder pretty much every second, the buildings close themselves out from the neighborhood. When you have so much pedestrian dedicated space, it's the opposite. People are encouraged to walk through the space in multiple directions, and I'll be talking about that as well in a little bit. Next slide, please. It's important to note that these mechanisms for access and the intention for creating relief and open space in the town center is not new. This is a policy that we've been working on for several years with redevelopment projects. The Seymour Street is the first example of that, where a public street was retired in order to create a public space that could serve multiple functions. We can also see a diagram on the left that our team worked on to help describe for the redeveloper and the redevelopment team strategies for borrowing from existing buildings, in this case, especially the historic Wellmont and Kahn, to become influential on the design of the new buildings so that character could be maintained, even though we are changing the rules of the game as far as creating opportunities for more inviting, calmer, quieter, safer, healthier environments on the streetscape. Next slide. A lesser known project, I think, just going by the number of people I recall who were in attendance, we have another redevelopment plan under construction now on Church Street next to the Unitarian congregation. The first proposal was actually for up to 6-story building that filled its block through, again, very helpful feedback from the Planning Board and the Historic Preservation Commission and other bodies and commissions in town. The plan on the right is where we landed. Next slide. Without getting overly technical, what was achieved was a much smaller frontage on Church Street. So you have a 3-story structure, stepping back on that 3rd floor to floors 4 and 5, and then pushing the rest of the building well back in order to create a public plaza, the depth of which matches the depth of the lawn in front of the Unitarian Congregation Church, in order to create a more ample space and preserve the character and sightline to that church, which is a beautiful building. So a lot of the same mechanisms and processes are at work here on Lackawanna Plaza. Next slide. And I think this drawing is a good way to get into this conversation about accessibility, safe space, healthy space. You're looking at a diagram that is doing a lot of things at once. So the supermarket has certainly been a key element, maybe the key element in this entire plan. And we can see how it's accessible from a number of routes. I'll actually start with a vehicular one. You can get to the supermarket from the east. You can either travel into the main plaza and drop someone off and then pick them up later. You could take an Uber. It doesn't have to be someone you necessarily know that you're relying on to get there. If you're traveling east, you could continue on and you park by turning off of Lackawanna Plaza and traveling up a ramp to the parking garage that sits above the supermarket. And then you can descend directly into the supermarket, your choice of escalator, stair, or elevator. And to leave, you would ascend one of those routes and you egress through here in your vehicle. You could either head northward or you could head westward in order to decide whether you're going to go north or south at that point. I'm showing these routes because I think there may have been some miscommunications or misunderstandings, or dare I say it, misrepresentations of the many ways you can get to this parking garage. It's accessible as well, traveling from the east on Glen Ridge. You can enter this building this way to get to that parking deck above the supermarket. Obviously, it's the same thing. If you're coming eastward on Lackawanna, or rather Glen Ridge onto Lackawanna, you can get to that ramp. Again, for the sake of time, I'll move on, but there are also thin purple lines. These represent the many ways in which pedestrians can easily access the site from neighboring properties. And it shows how we have retained the main plaza, Station Plaza, and the linear park, and this is now the pocket park, all of which you can access in a direct route if you'd like. You don't even have to stop and buy anything. You could just amble through here on your way, perhaps to Bloomfield Avenue and in reverse. So there's very much a park-like character to this entire property, which is unique to any development that's happened in this town in over 100 years. And it's, again, not out of the blue. These are picking up on lessons that we've learned from most recent redevelopment efforts. Next slide. So in many ways, the images I'm going to show you remain intact, and it's worth mentioning in terms of greenery, sustainability. The site, because it has new buildings, affords the design team, the redeveloper, the opportunity to better control stormwater. You're catching it on rooftops instead of asphalt. and bringing that water down in locations that best suit you. As has been stated in the press, and it's in the redevelopment plan as well, detaining water on site is what's required these days. So the creation of these plazas is not just for the enjoyment of above ground activity, but it means opening up the earth to create detention basins underneath 2 or more of these plazas so that water is held on site, and it mitigates the chances of runoff onto neighboring properties. Next slide. So that was the main plaza. Now we're in Station Plaza. I'm not sure if the top view has been shared very much, but it shows an alternate location for the horse watering trough. And in the plan, it not only calls for the preservation and adaptive reuse of this, but turning it back into a functional fountain. And we can see here, there's, I think, approximately 24 of the steel stanchions remain in place and provide shade for different kinds of passive activity here. So in the top view, we're looking east toward Grove Street, and the bottom view, we're looking west toward the supermarket. Next slide. And the linear park, I think this image has been shared a lot and published quite a bit. The image above may not have been shared quite as broadly. I don't know if we can zoom in at all. Keenan, is that an option? If not, I can. Not too much.
I can't, sorry.
Okay, no problem. So you can sort of make out that both of these buildings, this is D on the left. Oh, cool. I got some enlargement on my end, thank you. D on the left has lost its 6th floor, so has E on the right. But I want to call people's attention to what's happening at the ground level. We've got retail facing Bloomfield Avenue, classic urban street wall. It transitions quickly to alcoves that will be outfitted with electrical and lighting to serve the purpose of flexible festival space if people want to set up small areas in which to sell wares, crafts, and so on. That'll be easily accommodated. Right where we have a grade change, which is pretty much existing, the dramatic grade change has this wonderful transitional space, combination stair and ramp that brings you down to the lowest level of the site. That also is the point of entry for the residents of buildings D and E. It corresponds, I better clean up all this annotation. That lowest point corresponds to the pass-through underneath Grove Street. And then it transitions to a gallery wall, a reserved conditioned space, which we can see in the bottom right. The idea is that the property owner will be coordinating with local galleries, institutions, organizations who can use that space for changing exhibitions, so that the linear park really is sort of a destination of its own, a kind of outdoor exhibition space. And it's important to note that the passage under Grove Street is dramatically different than what we see today, much shorter because the rotunda is no longer there on the east side. The enclosure is removed on the west side, and the embankment is reduced on this east side as well. So you will be able to see very easily, before you even enter through here, that Station Plaza I've mentioned as a destination. Very wide and inviting and much better lit route than what we have today. And then as we continue on, we have the return of retail along Glen Ridge. There's retail on building B as well on the west side in order to provide continuity with the commercial activity that's been percolating and evolving along Glen Ridge further west. Next slide. So before we leave Greener, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about these images. We've worked with the redevelopers architects to get very accurate 3D models of the site and solar studies. The winter solstice is the most extreme time of year in terms of sun position. And I think it's important to note that, for example, at 8 a.m., you can see the shadows cast. This is the day of the year, the winter solstice, when the shadows are longest. At 8 a.m., the shadows are primarily contained on site, but by 9 a.m., all the shadows are contained on site. 11 a.m., shadows are contained on site. I'm in the upper right now. Bottom left, shadows are contained on site. That's 1 p.m. 3 p.m., shadows are starting to creep on neighboring sites. Keep in mind, sunsets at 4:32 on the winter solstice. So 3 p.m., we do have some shadow on the post office. The shadows have cleared the multifamily house at the northeast corner of Glen Ridge and Grove. So we're really only seeing a little bit of shadow on these properties. By 4:05 p.m., the shadows are getting much longer, but that's going to be true for all of the properties in this area. We can see, importantly, that the shadows are just beginning to touch the Montclair Mews, just beginning at 4:05 p.m. At 4:20, one of the things we learned from producing this model is that because of the change in topography heading westward and the presence of First Mountain, at 4:20, you actually have a blackout due to the solar exposure, the shadow cast by the upslope conditions and First Mountain itself. So we're talking about a 15-20 minute period of loss of direct sunlight in the bottom right corner. Not a very long period of time. Next image.
If I can intercede here, just real quickly,
Sure.
There's been a reminder from one of our attendees to try and use the cursor so the public can follow along.
Okay.
Yep. And if I can quickly share my screen, I just want to put my email address up. While I'm doing that, Ira, I did receive a question that, I would like you to answer in your presentation, and that's, I know we've talked about the height of the buildings in terms of stories. There has been a request that we provide information in terms of the change in height in number of feet.
Yes.
Okay, so for those of you, I really apologize that the Q&A function's not working under this webinar format, but here is my email address. It's jtally@montclairnjusa.org, and feel free to send me an email, and we will answer your questions hopefully during this webinar. And if you have a question afterwards, we can certainly follow up. So I didn't mean to break your stride, but I did want to get that information out there before we moved into another subject matter.
Yeah, no, feel free to interrupt. I think this is the first time we've done a redevelopment webinar, so we're making sure we're getting it right. So what I'll do is, and I think I might need your help, Keenan, I'll walk through this. This is the second and final solar study I will share. I'll give a couple of examples of height reduction, but Keenan, maybe you might have faster access to the changes in height than I would, but if we can't do it in this moment, I'm sure we'll be able to pick it up because I know you have slides, Keenan, that do specifically show the current building heights.
Yeah, I'm happy to cover that.
Okay, cool, thank you. So let's see, is my, so Keenan, I'm gonna reactivate my annotation tool so I can do a better job of identifying where I'm pointing. My option for that seems to have disappeared. I'm wondering if I need to, let's see, more options.
To click on the Ask to Annotate function at the top of your screen.
There we go. I got it. Yep. Thanks, guys. Yep. All right. So the summer solstice is another extreme time of year. It happens to be when the sun is highest in the sky compared to winter solstice. So it's no surprise that, let's say at 5:40 a.m., we do have shadows. They come from a different part of the sky because of where the sun is and the Earth's rotation, all that good stuff, the Earth's axis of rotation. Most of those shadows that are long, though, are dropping onto Bloomfield Avenue with low impact on neighboring buildings. And then by 9 a.m., one can see how tiny the shadows are because the sun is increasingly overhead. At 11 a.m., for example, the shadows are even smaller. 1 p.m. is practically the same, so we're on the other side of noontime. By 3 p.m., we do start to see some shadows. And then by 6 p.m., the shadows do start to grow. Now, again, because of the rising topography to the west, which is that away, we start to get shadows from the topography and First Mountain as early as 6:15, even though the sun doesn't set till 8:30. So you can see again, we're at 6, by 6:15, the area will be overwhelmed with upslope shadows. The Muse is barely touched here, Matthew Carter as well. It's important to note for both the winter and summer solstices that I've been discussing, we're talking about one day of the year, and this sort of occlusion or blocking by the sun will happen, as I've shown it, on those 2 days of the year, and for a little bit on 3 or 4 days either side of those days. So it's a very limited number of hours toward the end of those 6 to 8 days, let's say. Otherwise, the project is sculpted in a way that is very respectful of preserving light and air to its neighbors. Last, I want to point out, because it's also been asked, well, all of this open space and the greenery, the screening on the garages that's been shown on the east face and the south face, how much of that is really going to get sunlight? One can see, again, I won't go back, but what these slides show is that for very large parts of every day, because of the orientation of the buildings, the fact that there's a big gap, I'm looking in the upper middle now, between buildings D and E, sunlight pours into the South Main Plaza almost every day of every year. You get an abundance of sunlight in Station Plaza, and you'll get sun because this is mostly separated by a great distance from everything happening on the west. The Linear Arts Park will also thrive and should not be a problem. Next slide. Now we enter the last piece of this presentation, my part of the presentation. Again, I'll rely on Keenan for the differentials on the heights we used to have versus the heights we have now. I will mention before he does that, there had been some discussion or claims that the buildings could rise an additional 20 feet beyond the number of stories or the building height that was allowed. That language was in the previous plan because we were reserving a 10-foot by 10-foot footprint on each of the buildings for use for sustainable mechanical equipment. There's certain kinds of machines that reuse water that falls on the building or that's being used in the building, repurposing it for gray water or for even cooling the building. So we've modified that language, so there's no extra 20 feet that's allowed. The change is really now specifying that 10-foot by 10-foot by 20-foot tall piece can only be used if it is part of the sustainable mechanical systems. So we go into robust historic preservation, and for those of you who know me and my involvement with the township in days past, I'm very excited about this part of the project. We're now back on Grove Street overlooking Station Plaza, and I want you to notice on the left there is a rail car that keeps showing up in these images, and it's over 60 feet long. And in the world of historic preservation, it's generally considered a no-no to fabricate historic elements when they weren't there to begin with. Next slide. So a lot of you have probably read about the redeveloper's commitment to rail transportation as a kind of personal passion. And you are looking at the actual rail car that ran on the Lackawanna rail line that the redeveloper purchased and is currently undergoing full restoration in I believe it's the Whippany Railway Museum, which is a very highly regarded regional center for telling the story of rail in this area. These two views are already several weeks old, but the rail car serviced this station, and as unlikely as it is, the intention here is for this to have a home in Station Plaza or come back home to Station Plaza and serve this additional purpose of helping not just bring the station back to life in a way, but maybe become an educational tool so people can look in or possibly have tours of this rail car. But it also provides a lot of character for the space. Next slide. Now we're going to see some new imagery related to this space I described, the skylit passage. We're still on Grove. You're looking at the station plaza on the right. It's down below us, of course. The rail car is situated here. The supermarket occupies the first floor beyond. And this is the parking garage with one of the green screens shown. But the part of this image we're going to focus in on is over here. And the next slide is an enlargement of that area. So what you're looking at right now is the rejuvenation of this passage that connected Lackawanna Plaza, the street, to the east side of the site. You could walk up to the canopies or platform and board your train if you happen to be coming off of a carriage or later a car. You could walk right onto your train on that platform. But if you weren't using that first platform in the bottom right, you were more likely coming in through the waiting room and heading that way to one of the points of access off of Lackawanna Plaza where the other platforms could be reached. But maybe you were just walking from the west and needed to get to this platform. So pre-existing was this space. It was open on both ends. It had a skylight, and it protected you if you were in the waiting room and it had been raining or snowing or whatever. You could wait out here before you went to the terminal shed area or you headed east. This will be recovered and become an integral part of circulation in this plan. Next slide. How is this possible? How does it relate to Building A? So you're looking at Building A on the right side of this image. It's no longer a sheer wall continuing up from the column line near the platform canopy. Here's the historic platform canopy. It now steps back twice. And I'm going to clear this here. So the first step back is 8 feet. And the next step back higher up for the 5th and 6th floors is 4 feet. And there is a provision, a requirement now for a screen on the parking garage, which, as the prior view showed you, will help further reduce the apparent bulk and height of Building A. I hope this drawing illustrates how, by doing this, you clear out room for light and air to get back into that skylit passage. The skylit passage is what you're seeing right here. So in this historic photograph, you can actually see it. The red arrow up here is pointing to the skylit passage. Next image. So there it is on the right. This space exists today. It's just been blocked off to the east and west. So unless you worked at Pig and Prince or in Pineapple Express, where they store things currently, as you can see, you wouldn't even know about this space. You can see up through the skylight the north face of the waiting room, a very dramatic, exciting view to have and to bring back to the public. So in the current redevelopment plan, I'm looking now in the bottom left, we're going to open up the colonnade. It had always been an open outdoor space, and it's going to become that again. You walk past the waiting room to get a glimpse in, and there's a set of doors here, again, historic, that will be made functional so you can enter into the skylit passage and continue on your travel eastward or vice versa from east to west. I'm drawing over my drawing now. Next slide. It's an enlargement of that passage, that circulation path I just described, but it shows you a little more clearly how you can circulate from the east to the west, bringing back to life the original use of this western face of the waiting room. Now, the waiting room itself, you see it's also called event space. The current plan describes the use as reserved for events, exhibitions, and similar spaces. I'll also mention that the plan allows for enclosing the east and west ends, so this can be a conditioned space, which turns it into a rather functional space. So for events happening in the waiting room, there's expandability. If there were to be, say, a nonprofit or fundraiser or some other event here, you're not limited to just the space of the waiting room. People could flow and share the two spaces, which increases its flexibility and possible uses. Next slide. Here we have a view from the west, and you get a good orientation Presently, there's a storefront or glass and steel wall just a few feet in back of this colonnade. That goes away and returns this colonnade or group of columns to an outdoor space. So you are invited in to the doors I've mentioned. Here are the waiting room doors, so you get a peek in if you'd like. And the storefront enclosure over here on the left, beside the terminal shed, because the plan expects this former parking lot to be used for pickup and delivery for the supermarket, as opposed to typical consumers using that parking lot. The expectation is that we want to separate the more commercial traffic from the more consumer pedestrian traffic on the right. So that's how that would work. And we have one more view of this layout. Ground level, this gives you a better appreciation for how the terminal shed will appear. Building A steps back from that roof. We can see the entry into the waiting room and the doors that let you into the skylit passage. You'll also notice this view, which is showing the screen in front of the parking to minimize the mass and its presence. We have 4 swatches on the upper left of this image. And we also have more traditional manners of screening that are described in the plan. But in accordance with historic preservation guidelines, you don't want to create an architecture that confuses the public as far as what's old and what's new. And I do believe that it's possible to have a beautiful screen that's dynamic and sensitive to the craft and scale of the waiting room itself. So you're looking at 4 examples of that. Upper left is frosted window sort of scales, if you will. Upper right, you're looking at metal perforated banners that are interwoven. Bottom left is a honeycomb of ceramic elements that disguise what's behind. And then you have in the bottom right a more straightforward treatment of vertical wood ribs. All of these are depicted in the redevelopment plan and are possible directions, as well as solutions that could be more traditional, with that caveat that one doesn't want to put a building beside the waiting room that competes with it in character or appearance. Next slide, and it'll be my final note. Style, sustainability, and next step. Big intro for one last slide from me, and then I'll be returning this to Keenan. So I want to make sure people understand, when you look at the building masses that we're seeing in this presentation and that you've seen previously, we're using white or very simple boxes, and that's because the character of the buildings is what gets determined following the review and approval process for this redevelopment plan. The massing, the step backs, the stepping back, the site plan are really what's in conversation now. And what the plan describes is a very wide spectrum of possible styles, from traditional to contemporary. What you're looking at in the upper left is a more traditional design aesthetic, more historic, let's say, that is applied to building C, actually, with the waiting room shown here. We're standing in the intersection, or just east of the intersection of Bloomfield Ave and Grove. But you can see how it employs the principles which are described in the plan of traditional design on our main street, of a base, a middle, and a top. And there are ways to do this with historic character. There are also ways to do this with a modern design. And then we have just below it a building of similar scale, which is much more of the 21st century, let's say. This is a mass timber building, rates very highly in terms of its sustainability. And mass timber buildings don't necessarily need to be quite as prismatic as this one. The building on the upper right is mass timber. You can do stepping back with mass timber, just like you can do it with other building systems. But the point is that it is easier to achieve some of the high goals set in the redevelopment plan when you adopt more 21st century strategies for sustainable design and reducing carbon footprint for the project overall. This matters quite a bit. One of the benefits of this type of design as well is that mass timber behaves like steel, and you can get some very dramatic spaces with what we call cantilevers or long spans, which can happen outside of a building or inside a building as well. So it gives you a great flexibility of use. But none of this has been determined yet, because what's called the site plan review, which is a very brief term actually covers a lot of ground, inclusive of just what architectural character will play out on the site, whether all 5 buildings will share a DNA and style, or whether they might be related but different in the end, or all 5 unique, some more historic and some a little bit more modern leaning. So that's all TBD and not really part of the redevelopment plan, although you can read all about options and possible illustrations for buildings that we intend to use as standards or milestones for the redeveloper. With that, I want to thank everyone for their patience. Remind everyone, Janice, maybe before Keenan picks it up, this is a good time to tell everyone about how to reach you with any questions for our presentation this evening.
Janice, you're muted.
Thank you, Keenan. Okay, I'm going to pull up my information again. Let's see. All right, here we go. Share my screen with my information. We actually have received quite a few comments, but for those of you who weren't here before, unfortunately, the question and answer function and the chat function was not available for the attendees, but you can send me whatever questions or comments you have to my email address, jtally@montclairnjusa.org, and we will be happy to answer your questions. So I believe right now the presentation is back to you, Keenan.
Yes, thank you, Janice. So that was an excellent overview from Ira on some of the major changes that have occurred since October 2022. I'm going to talk a little bit about how these changes get codified in the actual revised redevelopment plan. There's 2 graphics to focus on first, and those would be figures 7 and 8 in the redevelopment plan, because these are very important in terms of implementing much of what you just heard from Ira. So on the example of the regulating plan, which is figure 7, for example, you see the addition of a new 4th open space in the area of Tony's Brook Culvert in the northeasterly corner of the property. You see some of the additional pedestrian accessibility and connectivity that have been created with some of the changes in the plan. But for the most part, the general configuration of the buildings and the overall site layout has really not changed very much since October 2022. However, and here's where I can talk a little bit more in detail about reductions in mass and building height in particular, but all of the carving away of mass that Ira was describing and visually representing through those renderings really gets implemented through the plan. There's a couple of tables, and then also figure 8 here, which controls all of the setbacks at grade, and then the upper story step back requirements for each respective building, as well as the maximum building heights. So a few significant changes to point out, starting with building A. As Ira indicated, there's some significant stepping back of the upper stories of this building that was not originally required in October. So here you see a step back of 6 feet, stories 2 through 4, and then up above that is another step back of 12 feet for stories 5 and 6. And we actually have now included a very detailed diagram of the relationship between the historic waiting room and building A, and that's figure 9 in the revised plan. In addition, for building B, a very big change here, which is that the 6th story has pretty much been completely diminished from the Glen Ridge Avenue frontage of the building itself. Whereas in the prior iteration, the stories 5 and 6 were stepped back 20 feet from Glen Ridge Avenue. Now we have a 100-foot step back for the 6th story, and then the 5th story remains at a 20-foot step back from Glen Ridge Avenue. The overall height of the building has not changed, but those step backs have been adjusted significantly. Now for building D, We did have a pretty significant change in the overall building height by losing a story. The prior iteration allowed a maximum height of 77 feet, and this revised plan requires or allows a maximum height of 67 feet. And of course, all the step backs have been adjusted accordingly. And then for building E, whereas the prior iteration of this plan allowed a maximum height of 74 feet along the easterly property line adjacent to the Mews, what's allowed now is 60 feet. And that extends along that property line as well as along the Bloomfield Avenue frontage, wrapping around to Grove. So with the loss of a story, we've been able to push the height down to 60 feet throughout building E on those frontages. So there's some pretty significant changes in building mass that now get implemented through this figure as well as the tables in the plan. I did want to just also run through some other significant changes and how they've been documented in the plan itself. So of course, with the reduction in building mass, there has been a reduction in the development program, and in particular in the residential component, whereas the prior draft allowed 375 total residential units, now 300 total units are allowed in this revised version of the plan, and that language is on page 28. You may recall that this plan allows for a certain percentage of the residential component to be what we're calling short-term rental units. Prior draft allowed 15% of the total units to be short-term rentals, and this revised plan has reduced that to 10%, and that's on page 25. The open space, while the prior plan was very clear in terms of requiring 3 different signature open spaces, there was no pure percentage requirement for the overall site relative to open space. So we've added that in this revised version of the plan. So a minimum of 20% of the overall redevelopment area must be dedicated to open space, which includes all landscaped areas and hardscape plaza areas. And that changes on page 28 of the plan. We made a couple of adjustments to the parking requirements based on input from our parking consultant, Jerry Giosa, and I'll do my best to describe those, and perhaps Jerry could jump in later if he needs to clarify anything. But in particular, we added a restaurant-specific parking requirement, whereas before, restaurants, as I recall, was grouped into a general retail category. Now we have a specific requirement of 1 space for every 3 seats, which is something that Jerry recommended. Likewise, you'll recall that the overall program here contemplates a mix of uses such that we can employ a shared parking program. And there was some discussion during our presentations last fall about the impacts of COVID and commuting trends on the shared parking formulas. And in particular, what Jerry recommended was that he's finding that commuting patterns on weekday mornings for residents aren't as regular as they used to be. And therefore, the time frame for the residential component has shifted from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. to 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. in light of the fact that many people tend to either stay at home or commute later in the morning. So that's been reflected, again, with Jerry's recommendation, this table on page 36. We've also significantly increased the bicycle parking requirements within the plan area. And this was another comment that we heard from the planning board, from the community back around the time of the original presentation. So the residential requirement has been increased from 1 space per 10 residential dwelling units to 1 space per 5 units. So essentially doubling the residential bicycle parking requirements. And we've also added a commercial requirement to the plan. So this is on pages 36 and 37, but for the commercial component, bike spaces shall be provided at a rate of 1 space per 2,500 square feet of non-residential gross floor area. So we want to make sure that there's adequate bike parking, both in terms of outdoor rack spaces, as well as potentially enclosed storage spaces within the buildings for tenants, employees working in the office, and employees of the supermarket and other tenants within the redevelopment area. As noted earlier, there is this fourth additional open space that's been required by carving away the northeasterly triangle of Building D. We're creating this new open area that we're calling the Tony's Brook Culvert open space. So that's now required, and that's detailed on page 38 of the plan. And in general, we've enhanced and gotten more specific in terms of landscaping requirements for each of the respective open spaces. So for the main plaza, there's a minimum of 25% of that space shall consist of non-hardscape planted areas and also include a lawn area of at least 2,500 square feet. Heard feedback that we didn't want another just hardscape, pure hardscape within the downtown, but let's try to integrate as much greenery as possible. So we've tried to do that through these requirements, particularly with the main plaza. But likewise for Station Plaza, there's a minimum of 25%, which will be non-hardscaped, and also another lawn area, which will be at least 1,000 square feet. And finally, for the Linear Arts Plaza, that one will also be a 25% non-hardscape space on the east parcel. We've also added some language that requires the redeveloper to provide an easement that would permit a shared egress driveway to Lackawanna Plaza to the benefit of the adjacent property owner, which is block 3213, lot 1. So that language is now on page 39 of the plan. So that would be executed presumably as part of the site plan review process as a condition of approval.
Keenan, your voice is fading in and out. I'm not sure if it's your microphone issue. Maybe you get a little
Try
closer.
to get a little bit closer.
That's better. Thank you.
Also added some specific language about including bioswales throughout the redevelopment area, and in particular between the sidewalk and curb as a streetscape feature. So that language is now included on page 49 of the plan. I know Janice and her team in-house at the township have done a lot of investigation of both the existing and anticipated utility situations within the plan area, and we have some specific language now, especially with respect to water and stormwater management utility infrastructure on pages 50, 51 of the plan that gets into some of the responsibilities that the redeveloper will have as part of the site plan process to make certain improvements to the existing utilities. There's also been reference to potential flood hazard area classification for a portion of the property that will be determined by DEP, but we've included some conceptual mapping as figure 6 in this revised redevelopment plan. And I think that would actually conclude the run through on the major amendments. So I think, Janice, at this point, we might be ready to turn it back over to you, and perhaps we can go back through the questions.
Let me jump in for a second, Keenan. I do have the building height listing. I could go through that really quickly just to round that out. So we're talking about 5 buildings. Going to go through all of them just to be complete and transparent. Building A, there's no change to the height of Building A, although there is the cumulative 12-foot stepping back relative to the waiting room. Building B is the one that lost the 6th-story along Glen Ridge. It was previously 87 feet along Glen Ridge. It's now allowed 76 feet. Of course, that's the 5th floor, and there's a stepping back from the 4th floor to the 5th, so it won't register as a 5-story building on the sidewalk. Building C is unchanged in height, although it got flipped around so that the mass of it is more respectful to the scale of the waiting room. Building D, that's also the northeast corner. That lost the 6th story, so that was previously 77 feet along Glen Ridge, now 67 feet. Same along Grove for Building D. It's also now, it used to be 75 because of the grade change, now it's 67. And then last, Building E, the building at the southeast corner, that was previously along Bloomfield 70 feet. It's now 60 feet. And there's a corresponding change of 10 feet along Grove Street.
Okay, thank you, Ira. Let me go through the list of questions that I have here. Again, my email address is jtalley@montclairenjusa.org. So the first question we have here is the developer, David Plasek, informed of these revisions? And I think I can handle that question. We did work closely with the developer. The reason this took 7 months to come up with the revisions is we had to listen, then adjust, then go to the developer, then go back. It's a negotiation back and forth to come up with a plan that is satisfactory and that's satisfactory to the township and buildable by the developer. So yes, he is aware of these revisions. The next question is, what are the facade designs as shown in the webinar, those stark white buildings, Ira, that you showed, are the final design? Or are there additional renderings that will be produced to show more contextual designs using brick and warmer materials? So I believe you answered that, but go ahead again.
Sure. What you see for what we call the building facades or cladding is not the final design in this webinar. The emphasis is on the massing, the scale of the building, how far it steps back as it rises, and also how far it sets back from the street line. The plan itself accommodates a range of possible styles, but emphasizes quality and goes to great lengths to quantify, not just talk in flowery language, but to quantify what distinguishes a quality building from one that might be average. And so if one were to read the plan and look at the design guidelines, which are very long, you'll find discussions about materials that encourage, the number of materials per building, the amount of fenestration or glass, all based on classic ideas of buildings that we've had in town that we admire and people have pointed to as being of higher caliber. So again, the time to see and comment on the architectural style actually happens during site plan review. That's that period after this redevelopment plan would be approved. There's going to be several weeks or even months when the redeveloper hunkers down with their architectural teams and really begins to study the architectural styles and then presents them to the planning board for review and comment. And traditionally, our office has been involved in that process with ongoing input from members of the Planning Board, Historic Preservation Commission, and others.
Thank you, Ira. Our next question is, I don't see any examples of BDP, that's the developer projects. Can you show us completed work as examples of the quality of work we can expect? So let me get a stab at this. This plan is the township's plan. It's not structured to look at or structure or based on any previous project done by BDP Holdings. I think it represents the township's vision, and that's why we brought in our own architect to work with their architect to come up with a vision that we want to see it at this location. We basically at this point, that's what the focus of this plan is. I don't know if any of the panelists, you have any comments along the lines of that question.
I'll just say that I've probably drafted over 30 redevelopment plans in the state of New Jersey, and we've never included any qualification information about the property owner or potential redeveloper in the redevelopment plan because it's simply inappropriate to do so.
That would be done as part of the selection of the redeveloper process.
Correct.
My next question, this is as a resident of a building whose sub-basement is constantly wet due to groundwater from the brook, I'm wondering how that will be handled. Even with multiple sump pumps, that area is always damp and not a healthy condition. So Selwyn and Peter, this is more of an engineering design or an engineering question. How can we ensure that there's no water problems in the lower levels of these buildings? And Peter, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Selwyn, you're unmuted.
The design will have to incorporate waterproofing and the construction methods, as well as foundation drains, the standard building construction issues, knowing the depth of the groundwater, and all those tests and calculations that have to be sent to the township for review and to meet all the stormwater requirements and building code requirements as far as what we know the ground contains. So, I mean, that's a design function, and it will be handled during that design, and it'll be extensive review.
So along those same lines, I have another question. I love the use of retaining pools for stormwater, but I hope the presence of water daily is not considered acceptable. It's not. If the brook passes under any of the buildings, how will it be dealt with? So this is a stormwater design question. Selwyn, is this something that you can address?
Yeah, so the state does have BMP manuals where so everything will have to be designed to the state's requirements. And so yes, all of the ponds will have to drain, but in terms of the brook, it will be continuing where it is currently.
And the plan does not allow any building on top of the Tony's Brook culvert, correct?
Yes.
That's correct. So we're not going to have any buildings over the culvert. So there's not going to be an issue where the brook passes underneath any of those buildings. Much of it right now is actually under Glenridge Avenue.
And Janice, I just want to dispel, I may have mischaracterized what detention basins are. They're typically below grade and not visible to the public. They are locations to which water is piped, and it sits in the basin or it can percolate into the ground itself. It's a controlled process. So the use of detention basins does not mean that there would be open pools of water at any time.
Okay, I have a question here. Another question. Are we supposed to believe what our eyes see regarding shadows over the site, being told where it is a minimum while you circle the shadows? If you could just paraphrase what the solar study showed.
Yeah. So yes, you should believe your eyes. I know that in the age of AI, we're sort of training ourselves to question everything we see. But I was a close witness and participant in the creation of those drawings. They are based on a digital model, which is carefully translated from existing topographic maps and measurements of the existing buildings on this site and for several hundred feet around the site. This model is then placed in a digital environment in a program that's specifically designed to locate the sun exactly where it would be on any given day at any hour of the day. And it casts shadows, and you can take snapshots of this digital model whenever you like in order to create the sequence of times to depict what are the lengths of these shadows. And you literally get to see in a very accurate form how the shadows are expected to fall. So it's highly reliable. This is not done by hand, and it's not done carelessly. It's done very painstakingly, in fact.
Okay, thank you. Next question about what is the garage screen on the west side?
Is there any more to that question, Janice? Or is that's it? So we have the 3-floor parking garage over the supermarket, and I showed that there's a screen required on the south side facing the waiting room. That screen is defined with extra language in the plan in order to be super clear about its purpose and character. The west side also has to be screened. Screening the garage is a requirement wherever a parking deck may appear in this project. There, the developer or redeveloper is given more latitude in terms of material and character. Options that are depicted in the plan include a living wall, the kind of screen or screen materials I showed. It could be more traditional, as we have, for example, on the Crescent deck, where you've got openings in the masonry facade, and filled in is either some kind of metal grill or metal fencing. And I think that's appropriate. I think that not having the same screen on the west, there's a virtue to that, because the facade can the building won't be as blocky by having identical facades south and west, but also the condition facing westward is very different than the condition facing south, where you have the waiting room and the main plaza.
Okay, thank you. I had a question here about the pickup and delivery that's going to be in the parking lot adjacent to Lackawanna Plaza, that surface lot that exists right now. The question is it going to be car or trucks using that parking lot?
Well, I'll say the little I know, but maybe Keenan or Jack, you could add in. I think it's intended to be van-like vehicles, which would pick up several orders and drop them off in the area. It's not space meant for semi-trucks or anything like that. So it could be individual typical sedans up to, that kind of smaller food delivery vehicle. But you, Janice, Keenan, maybe you know more about that. Is there more to say?
I think the key point is that all truck loading activity for the supermarket is going to be occurring off street within the confines of the garage, and that particular parking lot is really geared towards grocery store, pick up your order type.
Right.
That's right. I should have mentioned
just something that will get worked out in the context of the site plan review process.
Right. That's a great point. And to be clear, the Pathmark had all of its food delivery off of Glenridge Avenue. There were docks still present that face Glenridge Avenue. It's a similar area where the future docks are located, except Building B sits on top. So one would no longer have the sights and smells of the loading docks. And that's the only location where the larger trucks would be going for loading and unloading to the supermarket under Building B.
Okay, the next question is, can someone please point out access to the property, the supermarket, and the plaza spaces for people with mobility limitations?
So should we go back to the circulation diagram?
Sure. Can you see it?
Yes. And can you enlarge it all or go to full screen? Thank you. So the ideal circumstance, I mean, there are different forms of limitations on mobility. Obviously, if we're talking about entering this site, there will be curb cuts with depressed ramping, which is standard now for all new construction. So you'll be able to cross from, one sidewalk to another in a walker or a wheelchair, for example. So you can get onto this site. It wouldn't be any different from any other new development in that regard. There wouldn't be a curb or a wall ringing this site. Now, if you're approaching the supermarket at grade, all of the grade will be designed in accordance with ADA regulations, which means that there wouldn't be any additional steps or barriers to get you to the supermarket. We've discussed a curbless drive lane situation for the main plaza. So if you happen to be arriving by car, you would be dropped off and essentially on the same grade or very close to it as the supermarket. There might be a slight code compliant incline or decline to get into the supermarket, but there wouldn't be a threshold that you would have to overcome. You could, in a walker or in a wheelchair, you could just be rolled right in. So that's if you're arriving under your own power, or if you've been dropped off on the main plaza to go in and out. But the same would even be true, let me get rid of the sanitation. Same would be true if you were in a car and you were able to drive yourself, and perhaps you were transitioning to a wheelchair or a walker that you brought with you. You would drive in your vehicle up above the supermarket, park your vehicle, and take the elevator down directly into the supermarket. Again, no changes in grade. I hope that answers the question. Just reiterating again that per the redevelopment plan, but also just to get a permit today, you must comply with the ADA requirements, Americans with Disabilities Act. And they've grown over time to encompass all of the different nuances of these paths that I've just described, so that you have essentially universal access for people with different abilities.
Right, and along those same lines, Ira, we are maintaining the pedestrian passageway from the east side to the west side. So the intent is to try and make it as easy to maneuver to and through the site with minimal difficulty if you have any kind of disability. It'll be an even passageway.
Yes, that's right. And both in the rendering for the linear park, as well as one of the illustrations in the redevelopment plan, it shows how one can combine large monumental stair with a ramp so that the two can coexist in a very harmonious, beautiful way.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here about what % of the 300 dwelling units will be affordable housing. I can answer that quickly. It's 20% will be affordable. So we'll be getting 60 homes affordable to low and moderate income households. And on top of that, we'll also get 10% workforce housing, which will be affordable to households earning between 80% and 120% of area median income. Where will the taxi stand be located for ease of access to the supermarket? I don't believe that the redevelopment plan identifies the taxi stand. We identify short-term parking. And that again is along the loop driveway access from Bloomfield Avenue, as well as that small loop you can see here from Grove Street to provide short-term parking to building E and D. Is there any language between the Township of Montclair and the developer to have a certain percentage of Montclair residents on the project? I believe this question, the way Montclair normally addresses these types of issues, it's not appropriate to address that type of issue in terms of hiring Montclair residents. In the redevelopment plan, quite often that is part of the redevelopment agreement / financial agreement between Montclair and the developer. What we can do in the redevelopment plan is advance our local preference policy for affordable housing, and it is reinforced in the plan that the affordable units and the workforce units in this project will have a local preference, meaning that residents and employees in Montclair Township will get priority over people outside the township for those units. Okay, there's another question. What is the height of building A and what is the height of building C for IRA?
So just referring to my chart here, building A, the maximum height at the street line varies depending on which street frontage we're talking about. So building A, which is about 100 feet from Bloomfield Avenue, relative to Bloomfield Avenue to the topmost floor, 85 feet. Now, again, the topmost floor is set back 12 feet from the ground level, so it's even further from Bloomfield Avenue, but that's 85 feet. Along Grove, because building A fronts on Station Plaza, and again, that's about 80 feet, at least 80 feet from Grove Street, but that east face of building A relative to Grove, 80 feet for the height. And then on Lackawanna, the west side, and again, building A is several dozen feet away from Lackawanna Plaza. The height there, allowed height is 87. That's building A. Building C was the other one, Janice?
Yes.
Okay, building C is let's see, same thing. We've got a Bloomfield frontage, and again, it's set back from Bloomfield. I think it's approximately 50 feet, maybe 40 to 50. Facing Bloomfield 74 to the topmost floor, which has to be set back 10 feet, by the way. And then facing Grove on the east side, 69 feet.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here. Was a revised traffic study done? The last traffic study prepared was in February, and it was based on the original 375 dwelling units. We did not revise the traffic study to reflect the reduction in 300 to 300 dwelling units. Of course, a revised traffic study will be done as part of site plan review. Joe, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
That's the short version of it. We did take a quick look at the reduction and confirm that it wasn't going to change the conclusions of the traffic study, but we did not do another formal report. That would be handled during site plan.
All right, I have a question here. What is meant by short-term rental? Is that a hotel, Airbnb, or another type of use? I can answer that, or Keenan, if you want to answer that. Essentially, in Montclair, a short-term rental, we're defining it as a rental unit where the lease is restricted to a term of less than 30 days. And we are also further defining it as a short-term rental. It would be operating akin to a hotel, and because of that reduced lease term, they would then have to pay the hotel occupancy tax to the municipality, which would be another source of revenue for the township. Right now, we actually have no restrictions on short-term rentals. This does enable us to collect that hotel occupancy tax. Okay. Ira, you discussed 4 options of building design and materials. Cement versus wood. Materials seem to be at the opposite ends of preservation costs. Can you address?
Sure. What was the last word in that question? At preservation?
Preservation costs.
Costs, okay. The 4 materials I mentioned were specifically with regard to screening parking decks, not necessarily the buildings themselves. So I just want to make that point. The plan itself, I think, describes several more possible materials for buildings, and that range is offered so that the developer, redeveloper, and their architect can determine for themselves the appropriate proportion and balance of materials across this site. So as far as cost, we don't consider cost, but I will say that in addition to naming preferred materials, we talk about materials not allowed, and that would include the dreaded EFIS, which is an exterior insulated foam system that showed up on Valley and Bloom, I believe, and we limit the amount of stucco that can be used as well. So what we've done is to craft what we think are the ingredients or the DNA for quality buildings, pointing toward quality materials. It's up to the redeveloper to figure out how they budget themselves to work with those materials. And brick is certainly highlighted. Wood is tricky in our environment unless you're going to amass timber, which has been specially prepared and treated for our climate. So there's lots more in the plan. I don't know who you are, but I invite you to look at the plan or contact me directly if you'd like to discuss the possibilities and intricacies more.
Okay, thank you, Ira. I have a question here. Why do we believe there will be no issue with transient occupants in the midst of a residential structure? Keenan, can you address this?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
It's the short-term rentals. You're going to have short-term rentals in a structure that has longer-term rentals. I mean, I think it happens
Sure.
right now.
I mean, that's really, it's a management issue on the part of the building owner. I will say on pages 24 and 25, there's some pretty extensive requirements for short-term rental units. They will certainly be high quality, of the same caliber as all of the other, both market rate and affordable units within the building. I think the only difference would be that they'd be fully furnished. So again, I think it's really more of a management issue than anything else, but I do not anticipate any potential for problems, at least from the township perspective.
I have a question here. Is there a specific allotment that will be used for very low versus moderate income? That is established in our code. We have a maximum number of moderate income, a minimum number of very low income, and what's left will be low income. This applicant or whoever develops this property will be required to meet that distribution of units for those different income categories. And I don't have them off the top of my head right now. Next question, can we be presented with realistic photos? For example, the view from Glenridge Avenue by the Matthew Carter apartments show building D as significantly shorter than 2 Clover Hill Place, even while building D is elevated uphill. Ira, can you respond to the photo simulations that we prepared?
Yeah. It's a matter of optics and physics, meaning those building D is so far away from Clover Hill that it perspectively just gets smaller. Just as someone walking away from you, the further they walk away, the smaller they appear in stature relative to whatever is close to you. So that phenomenon is what's at work there. And the photo matching was done using a similar program as the solar studies. It is very reliable. I think it's tempting, of course, if you don't know these programs, you haven't set up these views before. And I took that original photo myself. It's tempting to imagine that it must have been fudged or it can't be right, but it is optically correct. And while the land is rising slightly, I think it is also the case that because building D is so far away, that we're benefiting, if you want to put it that way, from the great distance that makes building D just look smaller than you would expect.
Okay, thank you. Question, why do buildings A, B, and DE need to be connected by concrete? Are they in essence one building each?
So A and B, yeah, what a good question. That's an interesting question. So A and B are connected, and you could say they are one structure. That's how I would put it. And D and E are connected, and you could say they are one structure. However, if they were doing this live, I'd say, raise your hand if you think the buildings at Seymour Street is one big building. It's actually several buildings that share the same base, the same structure. And that's what you do have here. And that's why the guidelines are written the way they are. We have very distinct setbacks and stepbacks for buildings A, B, D, and E in order to ensure the appearance of distinct buildings. But they do share a structure. But the goal, but the goal and intent is that outwardly they express themselves as distinct buildings.
Okay, I had another question. I thought that the traffic study was going to be redone. At the presentation, it was agreed that it was not properly carried out. I believe at this point, we reevaluated the conclusions of the parking study. We did not redo the numbers as we were reducing the number of dwelling units. It was determined that a new traffic study would have to be done as part of site plan approval, and at that time, the numbers would be updated at the developer's expense. So I can answer that question. I have another question. Will a realistic 3D model of the proposed location, height, massing, and open spaces juxtaposed to the surrounding neighborhood buildings be available? Again, I can answer that. Not as part of the redevelopment plan. We have been working off of several smaller 3D models that were prepared from the initial study. We've brought it down. When the applicant comes in for site plan review, at that point, they'd have the additional building details and definition of the buildings, and would be required to do an updated 3D model. There's a question here. The Environmental Commission had asked that the Tony's Brook be daylighted for the culvert. I know we went back and forth. We discussed the potential daylighting of Tony's Brook, and in the end, we felt that that could create more issues. I know Peter and Selwyn, you were both part of that discussion. If you want to shed a little bit more light on why we decided not to daylight that, I would appreciate it.
So, would you address that?
Sure. So while there are benefits to daylighting the brook, there also becomes hazards. So we when looking at some other towns that have daylighted streams, especially that are close to residential or walking areas, there becomes hazards where, especially when you have lots of water that is fast moving. And so this is something we saw in another town in city of Passaic, where residents actually during heavy storm events would be put in danger and actually got sucked into culverts. And so that was something that, for safety purposes, could be a very dangerous aspect.
Okay. I don't understand. I have some questions here about when construction would start, the action plan for the current residents of the 375 housing units that will be involved. These questions, there are no residents right now. So this plan is creating housing. It'll create the opportunity to build at the site. So we can't tell you when the expected starting date of construction is. We have a ways to go. We have to get the plan adopted first. We have to negotiate an agreement with the redeveloper. We have to get site plan approval. And then they have to pull their construction permits and go through the detailed review process. So we're I wouldn't say a few years, but there's a number of steps we have to go through before we can start talking about actual construction. I think we already answered that. I answered that. Can you ask the presenters to show where the truck drop-offs would be, where the loading would be? I think that was unclear. So if you could pull up the plans to show where the loading would be, that'd be very helpful.
Arwa, do you want to take this, or I'm happy to handle it?
I'm good. I'll give it a pass, Keenan. If I miss anything, let me know.
So the loading for the supermarket will occur within the building, essentially. There's a ramp here. The loading will occur completely off street within the garage in a dedicated loading facility. Likewise for building B, there'd be loading occurring the same location. Buildings D and E, any loading would occur, and again, pretty limited given the predominantly residential nature of these two buildings, but would be occurring within the existing or the proposed, enclosed parking garage. And then finally for building C, it's anticipated that there will have to be some loading on one of the facades of the building, likely the facade facing the main plaza, to support the commercial facilities within that building.
So,
We do have, I'll just add, we have some specific guidelines and standards relative to both the location and the screening of any loading areas.
and I know, Joe, you looked at we had extensive discussions about loading for the supermarket, which is will be coming from Glenridge Avenue. Joe, if you just want to chime in on some of the issues that we discussed and the conclusions that we drew.
So the intent, if I remember correctly, is all of the trucks would be coming in off of Glenridge Avenue, backing into a loading dock underneath the building, and then exiting out towards the west, towards Lackawanna Plaza. While the final details will be figured out during site plan, to the extent that plans have been developed, that we have seen there, we can get the tractor trailer to make those maneuvers. There is enough room to do so. That'll all be checked again during site plan to make sure that any changes that are made on this one place on the site won't affect that we can still get trucks in and out.
So I have an interesting question here. What happens when the elevator malfunctions? I presume this means the elevator for the supermarket. And that's something that we certainly haven't thought about. That's the kind of question that we normally answer during site plan review. And I could see the planning board, asking for two different elevators or in separate locations or on separate systems so that if one malfunctions, you still have access to and through the building with a secondary elevator. But
Right.
it's not something we would evaluate as part of the redevelopment plan. Here we go. Is it correct that the only parking for the supermarket is in the garage? I think the presentation is there'll be short-term parking for the supermarket along the loop road for around the main plaza. There'll be some surface parking in that parking lot that's adjacent to Lackawanna Plaza. That's usually for someone who wants to pick up their items for the store pickup. And then the rest of the parking will be in a parking garage that's above the supermarket. How are consumers supposed to get shopping carts from the ground level supermarket to the various levels of the garage?
I can jump in on that. We've shared some detailed plans or been shown detailed plans of the potential supermarket layout. And in every one of them, it actually has three means of vertical conveyance: 2 elevators, a stair, and an escalator, because the expectation is just like at, let's say, IKEA, you're going to have people having a shopping cart and they may need to use that shopping cart to go up the escalator. So that's a third means. And yeah, I don't think I emphasized that before, but it might help address the question of, what if one elevator goes down? Can you still get a cart up and down? And the answer is there's redundancy built into this. But like you said, Janice, this has to be, it has to make an appearance at the site plan. It has to be reviewed, vetted by the planning board members to ensure that there's ongoing functionality for that.
Okay, thank you, Ira. Here's a question. Are there any guidelines in the plan for greater usability by people of different abilities and different ages that go beyond the ADA requirements, which are the floor and accessibility? Ira, I think I'll throw this one to you as well.
So that's quite open-ended, and I would like, again, for that person to reach out to me to talk more about that. But when we talk about different ages and abilities and use of space, one goes into territory that maybe some of us don't think about, but it would include sound and smell in addition to sight. So it's entirely conceivable that, and I have seen studies prepared by the landscape architect for this project where they are contemplating not just native plantings and so on, but opportunities for butterfly gardens or a garden, butterfly garden, scented plantings. These can be very useful to people who are not only maybe orienting more by smell and sound, but provide a different kind of experience than simply being able to get around from one place to the next. So I think relying on certain types of flora, which bring out certain kinds of fauna, would be a way to get at sort of the universal design that addresses interests of all ages. But there might be more behind that question, so I'm curious to know what if anything, the person was thinking about.
A question here, one of the attendees asked about the name of the food store. The name of the supermarket has not been publicly disclosed, so we can't talk about that tonight. In fact, we don't know for sure who the supermarket will be. Question here, do we know how many studios versus 1 or 2 or 3 bedroom units? Again, we don't dictate that in the redevelopment plan, except for the affordable units, which is dictated or determined by the ratios in our affordable housing ordinance. Do we know what the market rate rents would be? No, we don't know what the market rate rents would be. Are amenities for residents only? I think some amenities are for residents only, but all these public open spaces that are part of this plan, which is an integral part of the plan, those are for the public. So the plan does distinguish between public amenities and amenities for the residents of these different buildings. What plans do you have for the increased use of the Bay Street station? We haven't addressed that in this. All right, and I want to reiterate, we have somebody who asked about what will be the effect of the project. We do have an economic impact report that will be, it's not completed yet. I've been told it'll be ready next week. It's being conducted with the oversight by the township's CFO. So I anticipate her working with her consultant. She said she'll have the report available next week. Here, a question here. The main plaza is currently below grade from Bloomfield Avenue. How is the main plaza going to be graded to allow vehicular access? I don't know.
The grade change is actually quite minimal. I don't think it's more than a couple of feet of difference between the sidewalk of Bloomfield Avenue and the sidewalk of that first platform canopy. Vehicles currently use that parking area today, so a similar parking or drive lane would be employed, although I think based on how the plan is written, we would actually expect a curbless drive lane as it approaches the supermarket. So that perhaps for the person who asked that question would correct for any change in downslope toward the supermarket, because you'd be rising up those 6 inches to get to the same level as the sidewalk currently at the platform canopies.
Okay. Question here, where do you envision people will park to use the post office? Glenridge Avenue already has limited parking, and no one can deny that shoppers, diners, and visitors will use the few easily accessible on-street spots on a daily basis. So those are, I just want to say that that's on the far side of the supermarket. People who are going to the supermarket will probably will want to park much closer to the supermarket itself. That's one thing. We haven't evaluated the parking policies or the management of those spaces that are adjacent to these post office, but they will remain. Those spaces will not be lost. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, I would just add, our emphasis has been on ensuring that there's adequate and sufficient parking to support the project on site, such that, we wouldn't expect any significant impacts to existing on-street parking supply. But again, that's something that can be discussed during the context of site plan review. The township decides down the road that they need to make some adjustments to the management of those spots, so they could certainly do that.
So there's another question. Are you comfortable knowing residents? Well, this is the same question, so I think we've already answered that. Please define what ground level surfaces are permeable versus impermeable. What materials are required for permeability? This is regarding the loop off of Bloomfield Avenue.
Well, the plan,
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
well, I'll give the intro. I think you and Janice can fill out the details, but people might be disappointed or maybe not surprised at this point to know that that level of detail or the design of what is softscape or greenscape versus hardscape, that is not really set in stone or depicted for evaluation until the site plan review. But the plan does contain requirements for percentages of permeable surface throughout the site. So those requirements steer the redeveloper toward a solution that forces them to have landscape or soft coverage, which is usually permeable, turf, for example, or soil beds. Planters with trees and bushes, for example, are permeable. There are systems called permeable pavers, which, as I understand it, the state is, even as we speak, in the process of more narrowly defining permeable and impermeable because of the rapid increase in storm activity. And so the state, hard to know, I guess, right this minute, what the state's regulations will say about permeability and impermeability a year from now. But Janice, Keenan, is there more to say on that?
I think that you answered that question. We have about 7 minutes left, and I want to try and get through the rest of these questions that I have here. There's a question about what will happen to the original glass enclosed 60-foot train sheds. Ira, can you respond to that?
So the glass that is between the sheds, or I call them platform canopies, they're sort of butterfly-shaped concrete roofs. The glass we see between those roofs was introduced in the 1980s. So I just want to be careful to say original is different from historic. Those skylights that infilled in the 1980s will be removed. There's no expectation that those skylights would remain.
Okay. Let's see. It seems that shoppers and trucks use the same entrance to the supermarket. Do you think this may cause a bottleneck? Joe, can you address that question?
While shoppers definitely can come in the same way, the trucks are all generated to come in from Glenridge Avenue. They will come in to their own area, and vehicles coming off Lackawanna Plaza will have their own dedicated lanes. So while they'll be adjacent to each other, they're not going to be coming in the same drive aisle. They will be exiting out to Lackawanna Plaza on the same roadway.
I believe that the entrance from Lackawanna Plaza is also a ramp, so it'll be elevated above where the loading is, correct?
Yes, that the cars will be coming into a different level, so to speak, of the garage than a truck would.
Okay, here's a question. What is the greenest square in the middle of building B? I believe that's a green space. That's an open area for the residential areas of like private open space.
Right. Someone asked about amenities. Private amenities for these buildings are all limited to within the footprint. So if someone is referring to a different drawing that had like a different tone or color within the footprint of the building, whether it was building B or E or G, that would be a private amenity, some kind of interior court for use by those residents.
Okay. And I have one last question. What will the north face of building B contain? Will there be ground floor retail, facade screens, etc.?
Retail.
Yeah, retail with residential above.
Okay. Well, I think we're running out of time. It's almost 9 o'clock and we've been at this for 2 hours. And we've gone through almost all the questions, actually all the questions that I received here. I really appreciate everybody's patience in working with us. This is our first webinar, and so this was a so to speak, a guinea pig experiment. Even though we did a test run, we couldn't predict that when you click the chat box function, that it only applies to the panelists. It didn't apply to the attendees. So well, thank you for coming, and continue to send me your questions and your comments, and we will post responses on the webpage to the additional questions that came up. This video, this webinar will be posted on the township's website, or a link to it will be. And I do know that we're also on TV 34. So there will be additional opportunities for people to listen to this webinar. And again, in the following days, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I will try and get answers to whatever questions people may have. So panelists, thank you for coming. I don't know if you have any final comments. I don't think so. We've been talking for a couple of hours now, but we look forward to answering your questions and moving this project forward. Okay. Thank you for attending, panelists and members of the public. Thank you for listening to our presentation as well.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a good night.